Is South Asia the hotbed for Gen Z protests? These images show a new reality, a new wave of resistance in South Asia, a wave of a new generation revolting against the old order. The administrative buildings in ruins symbolize the crushing authority that swept the streets of Colombo, Dhaka, and now Kathmandu. Beyond South Asia, Indonesia and the Philippines have been gripped by similar demonstrations. But why are the Gen Zs in South Asia frustrated with the old order? And what exactly has turned South Asia into a hotbed for these mass revolts? What intertwined threads tie together the protests in Kathmandu, Dhaka, and Colombo? And what makes each case distinct and unique? Let's walk through the stories in today's Star Explains. This is Nepal from last week. This was Bangladesh in 2024 and Sri Lanka in 2022. These glaring images of fierce protests in the three capitals were largely led by the Gen Z, a category of youth born roughly in the late 1990s to the early 2010s. Their demands are stern and straightforward. They want to abolish the old rules and regimes that have escalated corruption, deepened inequality, and failed to address unemployment. Paul Stanilad, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, calls it the new politics of instability. An increasing number of frustrated people are seizing power and declaring themselves in charge when they feel betrayed by political systems out of tune with their demands. While the protests in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal were deeply rooted in their respective histories and triggered by events unique to each country, analysts say there's a common ground, a generation that wants to look beyond the facade of broken promises by politicians. It all came crashing down in 2022. The economy collapsed under crippling inflation. Daily life was halted by rolling blackouts and gas shortages. People were struggling just to live normally. Out of this crisis emerged Aragalaya, a Sinhalese term meaning the struggle, with the youth at its heart. Protest camps were set up, the most famous being Gota Gogama, demanding resignations and accountability from officials, leading to an overhaul of the entire system. When people entered the lush residence of Gotabaya Rajapaksa and he fled, it symbolized the political collapse of the old regime, brought about by the country's youth who demanded justice and an end to their misery. What started as a protest against the quota system suddenly turned into a nationwide demand for the fall of the regime against the backdrop of a bloodbath engineered by the Awami League and its leader, Sheikh Hasina. The state responded with brutality, lethal bullets, mass crackdowns, and an internet blackout. But each act of suppression only fueled more outrage. Eventually, the political cost became too high. Hasina fled in a helicopter as people swarmed into her house and the National Parliament building, celebrating the fall of the regime. What ties Colombo, Dhaka, and Kathmandu together and what doesn't? Nepal followed suit. Ordinary people were frustrated over unemployment and massive inequality. Add a ban on social media and rampant nepotism, and it spelled the ruling party's downfall. On September 8th, protests broke out and security forces responded with brutality, killing 19 people that day. Faced with mounting pressure, Prime Minister Oli resigned the very next day. So why did Gen Z erupt in protests in these three countries? Meenakshi Ganguly, Deputy Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, told Al Jazeera there are common foundations behind the youth-led movements that overthrew these governments: unaddressed socioeconomic disparities and corruption by entrenched political elites disconnected from the struggles of the younger generations. Two major economic recessions had enormous impacts on the youth. First in 2008 and 2009, then in the wake of COVID-19. This generation also spent 2 formative years in isolation, physically cut off from peers. These countries share overlapping demographic factors that expose economic and educational instability. Nearly half the population in all three is under 28. Their per capita GDP is much lower than the global average, but literacy rates are above 70%. Stanilad calls this situation a disadvantage for the ruling parties. When governments face protests, they have few levers left to pull, especially in unequal societies or during slow economic growth. One common outcome is that the youth grew frustrated with the old regime and its leaders, many of whom were of their grandparents' generation. When these governments were toppled, Nepal's Oli was 73, Bangladesh's Hasina was 76, and Sri Lanka's Rajapaksa was 74. Meenakshi Ganguly calls this a high level of dissonance among the youth, explaining that the young in South Asia can find little to connect them to their political leaders. Social media played a key role, arguably the most important backdrop of all three movements. Gen Z has found its identity on these platforms, using them to voice discontent over social issues and inequality. Blocking internet access or shutting down platforms has only backfired spectacularly on these governments. The internet blackout did not stop the Bangladeshi youth from taking to the streets, nor did banning 26 social media platforms stop Nepal's Nepo Kid campaign. These attempts cost governments legitimacy. They had to step down, leaving behind a trail of blood. Several experts agree that South Asia's Gen Z have been learning from one another. South Asian political anthropologist Jeevan Sharma notes that these protest movements took cues from each other, as well as other youth-led global protests, like those in Indonesia and the Philippines. Nepal learned from Bangladesh, Bangladesh observed Sri Lanka, and it's safe to say these protests are not isolated events. A different prologue of outcomes. As tourism-driven economies, Sri Lanka and Nepal cannot afford prolonged political unrest. So protesters left the streets soon after the governments were toppled and interim measures were taken. In Sri Lanka, a sense of normalcy has been restored since the new government was formed following the 2024 polls. In Nepal, however, some groups worry that the Gen Z movement, though idealistic, lacks maturity to lead such a fragile country. Protesters argue that the stakes are too high for the movement to fail. Bangladesh, however, is a different story. Its youth seem to have greater political aspirations. Protests over various causes and demands continued even a year after the interim government took office. Though elections have been announced for February next year, no date has been set, and there are serious concerns about whether the polls will be held on time and in a free and fair manner as promised. The next eruption might not look identical. It may be smaller, more regional, more specific, but the ingredients are present across South Asia, and the models of Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal provide a perfect blueprint. Now the question is, which country will the Gen Z shake next?